Oh, good morning. Welcome to Housing and Wealth Building, the fourth installment in the Chamber's Racial Wealth Gap series, sponsored by Putnam Investments. I'm Jim Rooney, President and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. Over the past 7 years, the Chamber's embraced economic inclusion as a priority issue for our business community. We're proud of the work, including the Pacesetters Supplier Diversity Initiative, ongoing policy advocacy that supports diverse and small businesses, our recently launched Massachusetts Apprenticeship Network, and the meaningful work of our board to include more people of color and women. And we're currently in day 3 of the Chamber and City Awake's Fierce Urgency of Now Festival that uplifts the next generation of leaders with virtual and in-person events and workshops across Greater Boston. With this virtual event, we're looking to the experts in housing and community development to urgently lead the business community forward to action. The panelists will discuss innovative, transformative, and long-term strategies that will build home ownership, a key to building generational wealth for communities of color across the Commonwealth. And with our virtual audience, including individuals from across Massachusetts and from every industry, we know that this is an issue that demands our collective action. In partnership with the Boston Foundation, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, the Bar Foundation, and the Eastern Bank Foundation, the Chamber is proud to be a founding funder and partner in relaunching the 2015 Color of Wealth report. Unlike that 2015 report that published the survey results and stopped there, a key goal of this initiative will be to include critical research to discover economic, policy, and community solutions that will successfully address the barriers that hinder the creation of generational wealth for communities of color. So today and in future sessions, we'll identify actions we can take as business leaders and community leaders together. While we actively work to close the racial wealth gap, it's also important to take stock of the work that is already being done by visionary leaders in our community. In fact, today we're going to hear from incredible leaders who are at the forefront of these efforts. Once again, I want to extend a huge thank you to Dr. Carolyn Crockett, who was instrumental in leading the Chamber and our region in this critical work. Before we get started with our panel, a few housekeeping logistics. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared on the Chamber's YouTube page. I also encourage you to utilize the chat and Q&A function during today's conversation, and we'll try to get those questions into the panelists. And finally, a big thank you to our Putnam Investment sponsor and their CEO, Bob Reynolds, a member of the Chamber Executive Committee, for their support of the Wealth Gap series. With Putnam's support, we're able to make this program series free and widely accessible throughout Greater Boston and Massachusetts. With that, I'm honored to welcome Stephen Denny, Head of Human Resources, Diversity, and Inclusion from Putnam Investments, to introduce today's panelists. Take it away, Stephen.
Thank you, Jim. I'm very excited to be here today. At Putnam, we are dedicated and committed to helping individuals and institutions succeed. And we offer an array of products to help them win. We believe in performance excellence. We are proud to partner with world-class teams and organizations who share our belief in teamwork and our dedication to winning. And those organizations that are focused on maintaining a high level of performance. Therefore, we are delighted to partner with the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce on this Racial Wealth Gap series. Under Jim's leadership, they continue to be a true voice for creating a truly diverse and inclusive Commonwealth that leaves no one behind. This is evident by the many offerings and trainings, initiatives that they've undertaken. And Jim, I know you're busy this week again, but we thank you for all you're doing. So on behalf of Putnam Investments and Bob Reynolds, our CEO, and the leadership in general, we thank you all for being here today, and it's truly my pleasure to introduce the panel. First, I'm thrilled to have Crystal Carnegie, Executive Director of Mass Housing, joining us today. I am quickly learning that becoming a member of Crystal's fan club is of the utmost importance. So I'm getting on board, Crystal. Under Crystal's leadership, Mass Housing's launched a highly successful down payment assistance program and secured over $80 million. $80 million, let me repeat that, to expand its workforce housing initiative. Before joining Mass Housing, she served as the Baker Polito's administration undersecretary for housing and community development, where she successfully advocated to increase state capital dollars for affordable housing. Again, there's a theme here. They focus on increasing rental subsidies for low-income families and dramatically reduce the number of homeless families in motels. And I could probably go on, but now that I'm in the fan club, I'm going to make sure that more of this gets out there about Crystal. So welcome, Crystal. Next, we have John Smith, Executive Director of Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. John brings extensive experience in the nonprofit, government, education, advocacy fields to his role at the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, having previously worked at TSNI, Mission Works, Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston, the Hyams Foundation's Youth Policy Initiative, the Tennessee Department, and at several other universities. I don't know Tennessee well, John, but my daughter happens to be in Tennessee today. She's taking a trip there. And I'm sure you can tell me a lot more about how she mentioned something about beers, and it made me really nervous. So we can talk later. John, he also served as the policy analyst in the Mayor's Office of Economic Development for the City of Boston, where he managed major economic development policies initiatives, and he brings this all to us today. So John, thank you very much. And then we have AJ Barkley, head of neighborhood and community lending for Bank of America. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting AJ before, but we were in a conversation earlier, and I'm learning that I have to meet her, whether she comes back to Boston or we head out to Texas to meet her. We now know that's something that has to happen. AJ leads the bank's work to ensure broad-based and equitable access to lending for, and capital for individuals, families, and small businesses across the economic spectrum. She's a longtime champion of affordable and sustainable home ownership and is responsible for the bank's community home ownership commitment of $15 billion. Wow, $15 billion. I like to repeat these numbers. Program to increase home ownership, particularly among first-time owners and underserved communities and multicultural borrowers. You see, as I talk about these folks and what they've been focused on and what they're doing, there's a common theme here. She is the co-executive sponsor of the bank's Black Executive Leadership Council, supporting strategies that empower and improve career and leadership opportunities for Black professionals. Honored to have you with us, AJ, and learn a lot more about the work that you're doing with Bank of America. And last, but certainly not least, I've really got to know a lot more about Dr. Crockett, Dr. Carolyn Crockett, over the period of time that we've been working on this series. And I can tell you, a truly incredible individual, and really helping us move the needle across this sort of how do we really narrow and eliminate this wealth gap that we have across our communities. Dr. Crockett is a professor of urban history, policy, and planning at MIT. You might remember that she served as the first, I think it was the first chief of equity on Mayor Walsh's when he was here, and really focused on embedding equity and racial justice into all of city planning operations, and making sure that the work that she's focused on, her mission has truly been around working at the nexus of education, economic development, policy, and urban revitalization, making sure that that continues to move forward. So honored to see you again, Caroline, and I'll turn it over to you and have you get us started.
Thanks again, Stephen, and good morning, everyone. Stephen, many thanks to you and Bob and the team at Putnam for making this possible for us today. So welcome, everyone. Such an honor to be surrounded by this distinguished set of panelists. I will go right to the meat of the conversation. My job is to keep us moving forward for the next 40 minutes or so. We have some questions, we have some comments to share. I know that we have a really large and dynamic audience out there, and I would encourage folks to use the chat function to send us questions that I will pepper through our discussion. So the racial wealth gap has been defined for us by the Boston Federal Reserve Bank as the difference in wealth between white households and non-white households, with a particular focus on Black and Latinx families. This speaker series has been inspired by the Boston Fed's path-breaking 2015 Color of Wealth report, a report that many of us here are familiar with. The report itself laid bare staggering disparities, not in income, but in wealth across our region, and in so doing, issued a decisive call to action. Wealth is a necessary safeguard against economic shocks due to job changes, health emergencies, or unexpected events in a family's life. And wealth is understood as a key element for securing a long-term sense of well-being, economic security, and health. It is worth noting that, in my view, these are the defining elements of social equity. The Chamber is pleased to support and build upon the impact of the Fed's important study of the racial wealth gap in our region, and we thank everyone here today for joining this critical conversation. Today, we are talking about homeownership and its relationship to generational wealth building. We are joined by a tremendously distinguished panel of change makers who understand that homeownership and wealth building are a long-term game. Whether you are here with us as a potential first-time home buyer, a financial institution hoping to learn from leaders in the field, or an employer aiming to create more opportunities for shared prosperity in our region, this panel has something for you. Owning a home remains the principal source of wealth for most Americans, yet we know that our nation's history, often troubled history, of discriminatory lending practices, including redlining, exclusionary zoning, and community clearance, as well as displacements due to urban renewal era programs and the interstate highway expansions, have together created an uneven playing field for many BIPOC and wealth-extracted families from coast to coast. Nationwide, as the Globe reports, 42% of Black households own a home, compared with 72% of white households. In Boston, the homeownership rate for Black households is 35%. And according to the Fed's own data, now in the process of being updated, most white families then were homeowners in 2015, right around that national number of the high 70s, actually, whereas most non-whites are not. In that study, the researchers showed us that Caribbean Blacks were most likely to own a home at about 49% in Boston among the non-white groups that were surveyed. Only 1/3 of US-born Blacks and other Latinx families own their homes, and Dominican families had the lowest rate of homeownership with only 17%. On top of this, we can add the news that over the last year, home prices and rents across the country have surged. For many families and individuals wishing to buy a home, the price has just exploded. Nationally, home prices jumped 20.6% as of March, the highest increase in 30 years. In the greater Boston region, prices are up 15.9%, also according to the Globe. And just this summer, Harvard's Joint Center on Housing Studies issued a report stating that a household here would need to earn more than $181,000 annually to afford a median priced home at $659,000. Without becoming financially burdened, that is what the household would need to earn, a household income that is much higher than most Boston households make, again, clocking in at about $180,000, north of $180,000. At this level, the Harvard report estimated that Greater Boston's home prices are nearly twice the region's median household income. So to really think about it, our household median income for the region is $93,000, a figure that is far out of range for most working families. So there is work to do. In response to the Boston Fed's 2015 findings on the racial wealth gap, a working group of local leaders sat with this data and recommended the need to create more supportive resources and leverage new homeownership opportunities. And while homeownership is largely seen as a critical strategy for helping to close the racial wealth divide, there are clear cautions here, as this kind of strategy does not represent a silver bullet nor a comprehensive way to address population-level ethnic and racial economic disparities. So the question is, where do we go from here? And what have we learned? Today's discussion will highlight stable, long-term strategies for building home equity in Massachusetts. I'm very pleased to moderate this conversation for the next 40 minutes or so, and look forward to fielding questions from folks as they come through. So let's get right to it. Welcome to our panelists, Crystal, John, and AJ. Crystal, I'll look to you as a head of an organization that has been working to finance affordable housing across the state for more than 50 years. I'm hoping maybe you can share with us how the Color of Wealth report that I cited and its findings have informed your work and strategy, and how so. Welcome, Crystal. Why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Jim. Thank you all for putting on this event, really helping to educate people. The one thing I want to start by saying is that the Color of Wealth report put data behind things that people of color already knew, right? And so it put that into a context for which it didn't seem like it was just a thing that people of color felt put upon by, right? So it made it real and live for the entire system, particularly for those maybe who didn't work in the community development space. The other thing about homeownership is it also, for me and mass housing, we always thought homeownership was important as part of the American dream, but it added this unspoken thing around wealth and why it was important. It wasn't just, community stability and, being part of the American dream and settling down. It was really about not just wealth, but intergenerational wealth, and really started to make people start to have conversations that people weren't really having before, right? Because you say that number and then it's like, well, how did we get there, right? And I will say the other thing really that the report did made people start to have conversations around the difference between income and wealth, right? And so, and help people understand that income is important, and we need to make strides in, in communities of color around even just getting to income equality. But income is a thing you use to gain wealth, right? Like income is what you use to buy wealth. And it's not a separate thing. It's like on the journey. And so as we talk to people about income and why income is important, we need to help people understand that income is important for the day-to-day, right? But it's also a tool to an end game. And we'd always been focused on homeownership. We'll talk later in the series about things that we're doing, programs that we're working on. But I wanted to start with that kind of high level kind of response.
So great. Thank you. And I think in our conversation, Crystal, you talked about how even though we're dealing with 7 years after the fact, that ring of the bell, that the Color of Wealth report issued is still relevant today. So thank you also for framing out the broader context here. John, let's come to you. So DSNI, an organization that I know well, I have to say that I did work there so many years ago as a teenager. So it's wonderful to be full circle with you in this moment. So the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative is a well-known pioneer, both locally and nationally, in creating one of the first community-owned land trusts in the region. And I'm wondering how you can just offer, if you could offer a few words on how wealth building as a collective practice also has informed the work for Dudley's residents. This is a great compliment to Crystal's sort of piercing this point about home ownership is the American dream, the idea that you have a single family home for yourself and your family. And so let's sort of complicate that a little bit in terms of how DSNI's work helps us think about collective wealth building.
Sure. Thank you, Carolyn. And I'd like to say thank you to you and Jim and Stephen for having us all here. I just think to start with, I think that report, which was about 7 years ago, really buttressed, as Crystal said, that how segregated and balkanized, Boston can feel at many times. And I think we understand that feeling. And I wasn't surprised by the report in many ways, being sort of policy at the mayor's office and really sort of seeing sort of the disparities on all levels. It really didn't come as a surprise, but still, it sort of feels like, how could we still be in this place instead of feeling that 7 years later? And I think one of the things about DSNI is, DSNI 30 years ago started through DNI, Dudley Neighbors Incorporated, this community land trust. And for those who don't know, community land trusts are like nonprofit organizations that own land and basically lease it out and for folks to help develop home ownership, rental housing, farming, commercial space, community gardens. And so we don't sell land. What we do is we remove it from the speculative market and protect it for community use and community can develop it. So we uphold, in terms of our work, that principle of people over profit and the use value versus the exchange value of land. So DSNI really has developed as this model for folks, over the last 30 years, because we've seen that this land trust that is basically community control, has staved off the displacement, right, that has been happening all over Boston and other cities, actually. And, if we think of race and class and power in terms of gentrification, that I'm talking about is the community land trust owners, folks who are owning their space there, have been able to really push back against that by maintaining control over that land and what gets developed there. So I think, yes, this report has sort of blown everything up and really showed us, that the inequities are caused by systems, but that we've been able to push back against those systems by just holding on to that land and holding on to community control of land.
And in so many ways, creating a new kind of system, a new kind of a success story, which DSNI absolutely stands as in terms of what to do in the face of tremendous economic pressure, the speculative market. How do you protect economically vulnerable populations in the face of that? So a long-term story here, but it's definitely connected to this moment that we're all in right now. Thank you, John. And in that conversation about this ongoing moment that we're in, it definitely makes me sit here and think about the aftermath, certainly of this ongoing racial reckoning in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. And so, AJ, I'd love to turn to you and think about this point in terms of the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and this in our nation's ongoing racial reckoning. In the face of that, Bank of America pledged $1 billion, not a million, not 100,000, but $1 billion, a big number, to address economic and racial inequality in the U.S. The pledge, in many ways, it seems to me, also builds on Bank of America's community home ownership commitment program, but with a twist. So can you talk, AJ, about any of the early successes and lessons learned from this new set of investments being led by Bank of America? Welcome.
Thank you very much. Before I do that, John, I think the land trust also protects against gentrification, some of the other things that are affecting the community. And so we probably should chat a little bit about that because, you know, people are picking properties up and just growth all over. But to your point, the one thing I would say is Bank of America was committed to racial equality, advancing racial equality and economic development prior to that horrible, unfortunate situation with George Floyd. We already had dollars and commitments in the community, both locally and nationally, because it is part of our core values. I think that we had already had programs that were already launched, but I think it did for us is at a local market level. You think about, you know, Boston, or you think about the local markets, we have market presidents sitting in those markets, and there were some specific needs for those markets, not necessarily just enterprise needs. And that helped to solidify or to continue to influence the strategy at a market level on how we might affect the local communities around employment, around housing in general, not just not just housing purchasing or people having the ability to purchase a home, but also rental. We've done some things in Boston with Mattapan, I believe, was one of the developments that we've done some good work on. But to your point, we've done work around jobs, et cetera. But the one thing we did launch and we're very committed to, back to this point around home ownership being just one of the ways to build generational wealth, there's a lot of ways to do that. We realized by working with local markets and local communities that we needed to really find ways to mitigate the largest barrier to home ownership, besides the income piece, right? You got to have a job, you have to be able to repay and the ability to demonstrate that you can repay and pay your bills, et cetera. But we launched, to your point, Dr. Crockett, the community homeownership commitment in 2019. And when we launched the community homeownership commitment in 2019, it was $5 billion of lending across, you know, just under 70 markets. And our goal literally was we were going to put 20,000 additional people, individuals in homes. And the reason the program was determined or decided is there's kind of three barriers to home ownership. And they continue to be the same three barriers, by the way. We've just got to continue to chip at it. One, a low down payment mortgage, a conventional, boring, consistent, repeatable mortgage, qualified mortgage with no hidden bells and whistles that could affect the client long term. So I'm like, we're boringly consistent. So a low down payment, I see Crystal smiling, a low down payment, consistent repayable mortgage. But the two biggest barriers are really reserves. And it's really having cash reserves for first-time home buyers for closing cost assistance and down payment grant. So what we said is, and just, you know, we reflect on our own programs to say, what can we do better? So initially our closing cost program across the country was $5,000 towards closing costs, which to pay non-recurring fees, but also to help you pay your rate down, right? Because this is about sustainability. But we realized $5,000 wasn't enough. So we have a 3% down payment. We increased our $5,000 to $7,500 for closing cost assistance. And then the biggest barrier was really down payment, because a lot of people think you have to have 20% down, and it was causing people to say, oh, I can never get a home, and generation after generation, because they talk to their family members, they talk to others who may have gotten a home 10, 15 years ago, but things have changed. And so it was $7,500 in closing costs and 3% up to $10,000 in down payment grant. So the cash reserves, non-repayable, was up to $17,500. So that automatically removed that barrier. And so we rolled that out in 2019. And then we just it was so, people loved the program. It spoke to what they were trying to really address across the country. And then we expanded that. So our now plan is $15 billion. So we went from $5 billion to $15 billion in lending through 2025. And just to give you an update, we've done about $9.5 billion of that $15 billion, over 60% of the lending. We've done over $354 million in grants, non-repayable, and we put an incremental 36,000 people in homes. And so these programs make sense. The other thing I would mention, and I know Crystal and John would appreciate this and others, the grant program can be layered with other grants at the municipality level. So when we started working on this program, this gets to kind of what we should be doing as we talk about those that are with us today. People didn't believe us. And, you know, we had to work with partners like those that are many on the phone and people that are local in the community, realtors and, you know, HUD, education and counseling agencies, et cetera, to demystify the process. And so we're really proud of that work, Dr. Crockett, but we have more to do. But that's one of the things that we believe is a proof point. And the last thing I would say is, first and foremost, homeownership is about shelter and people having some consistency in shelter. So to help people get in homes is important. But we also know it's helped a lot of other things around health and wellness of people's entire families, not just the fact that this is a wealth generation builder.
AJ, thank you for that. And thank you for giving us a sense of not only the scope of your work, but the impact, some of the early successes here, and also giving us some details that can help equip first-time home buyers. And so I'd love to think about that for a minute. We've gotten into some of the details. We're fortunate in that this panel represents folks who are in the private sector, the quasi-private. I think I'm supposed to say to Crystal, you, AJ, clearly in the private sector standing there, and John sort of giving us that front edge of nonprofit on the ground organizing work. And so we really have a mix of folks here. And I'd love to just think a little bit about advice for folks who are thinking about buying a home, maybe for the first time. As Jim mentioned, we are joined by many attendees of the Chamber and the City of Wake's fierce urgency of now. Festival attendees are here trying to figure out what their long-term future is. And so I wonder if there's advice that you could give to our attendees as they think about approaching the Massachusetts housing market, which is kind of stunning, but is a thing. And what should people be thinking about as they work to build long-term wealth for themselves? Crystal, maybe we can start with you. Give us some insight or some advice to folks who are inspired by some of what AJ was sharing and maybe nervous, but trying to think about what's what.
Yeah, I was going to start with something that AJ said is like, you should believe people, right? It's like there are a lot of people who missed an opportunity when we had these incredibly low interest rates. I was talking to somebody yesterday and I'm like, interest rates are now like 5-6%. And I was like, that's an average interest rate. The fact that they were like, you could get a house for 2%, that was an anomaly. That it's been decades since that happened in the American finance system, housing finance system. So, the saying says that there's the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. And so this idea of, you're going to wait for the right time. The right time is when you can afford it, and it's now. Because so don't let that get in the way. And go off and do all you can to take advantage of things that exist at Mass Housing. We have a down payment assistance program. You can get up to $50,000 if you live in particular, if you're going to buy in a particular community, and up to 10%. You can get up to 10% of the purchase price. And so, you should go look into that, and you should not tell yourself that, oh, I don't qualify. Go ask if you qualify. And right, don't knock yourself out of what could be a blessing. Don't block your own blessing. And so go ahead and do that. And remember that it's your first house. It's not your only house. It doesn't have to be exactly where you want it to be and exactly where you see yourself for 40 years. This is your first house. It might be where you end up for 40 years, but it might not. And it's okay. And you don't necessarily have to, live exactly in the place that you want to live. When my son was hesitating about moving out, he was like, well, I can't afford to live where I want to. I said, me either. That's why I live here. Right. It's like,
Yeah.
right. And so it's like, you gotta get yourself out of the idea. This is likely to be the biggest purchase you ever make. And I'm not saying to just, buy anything, but also don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good to kind of get you into the marketplace.
Mhm.
And there are a lot of state programs. Mass housing goes up to 135% of the area median income. And so it's not just for low income people. So you should, really look into what might be available to you across the spectrum.
Great advice. I love this idea that the best time to act, to do something is now and 20 years ago. You don't have to feel like you've missed the boat. There's a window here. Also, AJ's previous comment about the fact that many of us do have this notion that you need to have 20% of that down payment together, and that's not necessarily the case. Oftentimes it's not the case. So thinking about all these kinds of options and resources is fantastic. Thank you, Crystal. John, how about you? Do you want to weigh in here and maybe think about first-time home buyers or maybe people who already have a home? What kind of advice might you give to people? Because DS&I has been in this game for a while now, and so you may have some reflections to share.
Yeah, I think taking advantage of all the things Crystal has talked about, I think there's lots of homeownership programs, down payment assistance programs, and all of that. So I agree totally. I think sometimes the unstated challenge, especially for people if they're buying a house and when they buy a house, what we hear a lot is that it's sustaining ownership of that house. Mm-hmm. So we have, for instance, and it's interesting as we frame this around wealth and wealth building. So you have, for instance, people who are buying houses and maybe working 2 or 3 jobs to sustain paying for that house. And, they're thinking about underground, not from any of our policy standpoints and wonderful frameworks, that when you talk to them, and this was really apparent during the 2 to 3 years of COVID, if I lose my job, I cannot keep my house. And then what happens then? So, I remember just anecdotally having this conversation with someone who said, I work 2 jobs, my partner, wife works 1 job, and they have these 2 children, and, reduced hours, and it's becoming more and more difficult to keep my house. So, programs that help support that, because this person said, now, if I lose 1 job and I keep a job and my wife keeps a job and I go to get support, because of policy issues and because of, sometimes they don't want to support you because they think you're making too much and you have to be making this level, and they don't understand, so there was this whole conversation around how do we sustain home ownership? Because we will make the argument, and I think successfully, that, home ownership and the building of intergenerational wealth is important. And people on the ground, when you say that to them, it's like, I own my house and I'm not wealthy. I have to basically keep on working, have not taken a vacation in 2 years, can't afford to fix all the things that are wrong even with my house, whether it comes to heating or the roof so sometimes, sort of going off a little bit on your question, Carolyn, but I think sometimes we have to also think about putting people in a house is great. How do we sustain them keeping that house?
Appreciate that point. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, John. AJ, definitely want to invite you here.
Yes.
And now broadened us out a little bit from thinking about first-time home buyers to also considering how do we keep people in these homes that we're saying this is the way to go, and to make it a larger strategy around wealth building. How do we think about that? So AJ, I know you're up for the challenge. So
I love everything that Crystal said, and I think John's spot on as well. A couple things I would say: everyone should start with financial wellness overall, because we miss that point sometimes. When I talk to community advocates and I talk to people that are trusted in the community, that are dedicated like John and Crystal are, to helping people realize this power of home ownership, what they consistently say is, we got there, we got the down payment, but if the water heater goes or the car goes or different things that go, people are underwater because, and that's why the down payment programs matter. So the way I would even or kind of frame this for people, when we launched our down payment grant, the way we talked to housing counseling agencies and individuals and families and realtors is we said the message shouldn't be, don't worry about a down payment grant or closing cost assistance. The message should be the dollars that you were saving for down payment and closing costs to be prepared for home ownership. Those are dollars, if you have them available, as you think about financial wellness, that you need to have prepared for emergencies, right? It's on average, I think 3 months. And I'm not saying that can happen everywhere, but I think the messaging can't be, we're just giving you the grant, good luck when you get in the house. It does need to be the overarching financial wellness discussion with people, so that they may need to change behaviors in their own household, et cetera, that they have control over to be ready when something breaks, because that it will break. And to Crystal's point, it may not be your ideal home. It may not be the house, where it's brand new. You could be buying a house that may have some aging to it in the situation. So I think home ownership is first, again, around financial wellness, really, really important. And then this is what I always tell people when they think about this. Wherever you do your financial practices, whoever or whatever is your financial institution, you should call them, reach out with them, schedule time to understand the full suite of solutions that they have available to you that may help you with the things we just talked about. Better ways of saving your money. Is there programs to help you save faster, leaner, meaner? Are there ways that you can learn about other things that may be in the community that you don't know? Because I think the problem we have, and I love how Crystal said it, you could be blocking your blessing because you listen to someone that doesn't have access or knowledge around all of the tools and resources that are available to you. Go where you feel that you can trust. And look, I don't mean trust because this is your family member, et cetera. I'm suggesting people go to places that this is what they do every day, in order to help people understand things that are available to them. Because I think the biggest barrier, quite frankly, that I see when I talk to people is they just don't know what they don't know. It is an education and awareness. And we have got to continue to encourage that for people. And the last thing I would say is a lot of times people think their title and the job they do, that it's embarrassing they don't know certain things, because they are like doing this job, they got this big title, they got this great job, and they're embarrassed to ask the questions. And so hopefully the people that are listening to us today, Dr. Crockett, that may be in this bucket, we have demystify a little bit so that they feel okay in asking the questions, because there's so much out there that may help people. And then the last thing I would say, there is a lot of focus on first-time home buyers. You could be a first-time home buyer, and then you decide to get your next home, like Crystal was saying, that is investment property, potentially the house that you were in. And so people need to think that way as they start to broaden. And then rental housing markets, to your point around interest rates right now, Crystal, at least with a house, you have some stability on your monthly payments versus the volatility in the rental market. People should think about all of those things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And thank you for such thoughtful comments. All of you, you are all living up to the hype as being frontline experts here and really taking us to the heart of the matter.
Dr. Crockett, do you mind if I add to that?
Sure, please do.
Sure. One thing in particular that AJ talked about was sustainability of a mortgage, right? And so like a really boring fixed rate 30-year mortgage, right? It's like, you can call it boring. It's not, they call these other things exotic mortgages. I don't get an exotic mortgage. Get the really boring one, right? If you want exotic, like buy a new dress, right? It's like, but like, you want your mortgage to be really, really boring. I would say to people, I've often had people say to me, well, I'm really concerned. What happens if I lose my job? And my response to you is, what happens if you lose your job where you live now? Like losing your job is an event. It doesn't matter really. Like I know it's scary, right? It's supposed to be scary, but losing your job is going to cause you disruption in a lot of ways. I would argue that you're likely to get more help if you're a homeowner, because no one wants to unwind that mortgage. Like no one is excited about that. If I'm sure AJ can talk to this, like a bank would like find any kind of way to keep you in the mortgage if you're, being upfront and honest about what you can afford to pay. It is in everybody's best interest that you stay in the mortgage. And what I generally tell people around down payment assistance is that it is actually, to AJ's point, it is actually a thing in which you should save your money for emergencies, but it is actually helping you buy immediate equity in your home. Right? If you think about it like that, it's not just, getting you into the house, it's helping you buy equity. And so the way we generally talk about it is like, many people got their first home by asking, by going to the bank of mom and dad. And so the way Mass Housing, we think about our DPA programs is we're going to be your bank of mom and dad. Right. And because oftentimes you don't have the access to intergenerational wealth that some other people do.
And that definitely resonates for me myself as a first-time home buyer here. I remember cobbling my little dollars everywhere from under the mattress, from an old savings account. I think I cashed out a savings bond to just try to get that money together. So it's encouraging to think about what it means to get a mortgage that's stable, a fixed rate, nothing exotic, just go for it and try to make it happen. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the elephant in the room, or the challenge here in this conversation. I mentioned earlier that although we talk about homeownership as the way to really begin building intergenerational and long-term wealth, there's a caution here. Many of us, all of us actually learned some very hard lessons during the 2008 foreclosure crisis. And first-time homeowners, even now, or folks who have their home now, are concerned about how to protect themselves in the face of powerful financial institutions that shape the market. And so what do we say about this idea of the caution and the promise of homeownership as a wealth building strategy? We talked a little bit about that here, but I'd love to see what else folks might offer. A recent commentator had even shared that if we were able to get down payment assistance to everyone, even in this region, we simply do not have enough housing right now for everyone. And so, as we say, home ownership, get your home, get your mortgage, let's get going. What is the caution? What can we say? I'm aware that we have many lenders in the room. We have lenders here on the panel. How can we talk about the caution of this work and of this lesson? AJ, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think we've got to be more, I think this affordability issue of inventory and affordability is the other issue, right? So even with the programs, in an inflated market where you get 20 people trying to put a bid on, one house, and then, the increasing cost of the house in that position, I do think we have to think about other ways. I think the work that John's doing and others are doing may be another mechanism to help people with potentially inventory. Because if I remember correctly, people are in when with land trust, they go in and then they may move out. If I'm right, John, they move out and they may then be in a position to go purchase their next home. That land is still available, and that house is more affordable. So I think what we've got to do locally, working with local communities, chambers, et cetera, as you think about our major markets across the country, where is there an opportunity with maybe things that we would not have traditionally thought about in terms of inventory, in terms of housing? And the one thing that we're working on is community reinvestment work, which is really how do you go on communities that we want to be able to stabilize economically, or be part of that stabilization of that neighborhood, those 5 blocks and 6 blocks. Is there a way for us to partner appropriately with people who have similar goals, so we rebuild in those communities that then creates equity in the home that people that are already in those communities, to kind of what Crystal was saying, that then empowers people who currently have homes but are not in a position to refinance those, potentially refinance with, changing their rate or refinancing with cash out to be able to do some additional things that are important to them. So there's three things: community reinvestment work where people are already, and then secondly, thinking about other solutions that is not just about buying a new home. And then the third thing I think we talked about, look, I don't think anyone's going to see what people keep referencing back to 2008 again. Because just to put 2008 in perspective, there was a lot of activity that was not necessarily, and this is a general comment, that really wasn't about people necessarily being ready for the full gamut of home ownership, right? Which is, you have to have fully underwritten loans. You got to verify income. You got to make sure there's a debt to income ratio, right? And so you should not be getting a house if your debt is 80% of your income. That means you're not ready, in this case, to own a home. You may have to have a different solution set and a different savings plan. But I would imagine John probably has some thoughts around like what else we can do, because I think there's more creative stuff that we hadn't thought about that is sound and safe, right, Crystal? And repeatable and boring, but things that we may not have traditionally thought about.
Put all the homes in land trust. And I say that honestly, because actually during the foreclosure crisis, DSNI and the land trust did not have one foreclosure. And in fact, we're looking at it a couple of weeks ago, I think over the last 30 years of the land trust, there's probably only been 3 foreclosures over all that time, because we are able to make it affordable long-term, right? There's a formula that we use in terms of if you resell your house, you can only resell it for this amount, does enable you to go and buy another house, but it's not exorbitant and it's not market rate. So the problem for us is then that we have banks and other financial institutions who, because of that low level, don't want to capitalize and refinance sometimes. So that's sometimes a challenge. But I think that the idea of cooperative housing, land trust housing, really helping to own the land and stabilize the community is what's really worked for us over the last 30 years. Nothing, and that's boring, but right, Crystal? But I think it's been effective, like absolutely effective. I know we're getting late, but Carolyn, I also want to think about we're talking to this and framing this from the idea of wealth and wealth building, which is such an interesting discussion for me, only because I think of so much of what we think of wealth. If one aspect of thinking about wealth is that wealth offers you freedom to then do other things, right? So again, people who are first-time home buyers, people who are just working and trying to stay in the house, they don't have the freedom to lose their job or to lose their healthcare or to lose anything that the safety net provides them to keep this house. And so I feel like there's other structural issues that, 2 days ago, we were at Boston Medical Center and learned that, for instance, Mattapan, which has high home ownership, and it's primarily, the Haitian population and other immigrants, have horrible health disparities, right? Which is part of, if you think of health as being part of wealth and, all the different socioeconomic things, I think we have to address all of that and not just the idea that people are owning things and somehow being wealthy and being able to transfer it in intergenerational wealth. So I feel like the wealth discussion has to be buttressed by all these other discussions that we're having.
Yeah, agree. Thanks, John. Krista, I'd love to get you in here. And we have a couple questions from the audience that I'll share before Jim comes in and takes us home. But Crystal, what's your thought about the caution and the promise of home ownership as a wealth building strategy?
Sure. I want to get back to what AJ started out saying is like, you got to get your financial health together before you start, thinking about, really seriously thinking about wealth, right? And as John was saying, at particular incomes, losing a job is an event, right? And so, and many people of color, particularly in at least my generation, are making more money than anyone could have imagined, except that they become the place in the family in which their money, right? Like you're supporting a family. And so if something happens, you got to do that and that. And so understanding that whole dynamic is important, right? It's like, because it's not just your own personal emergencies that you have to be thinking about, it's others. And I would say the biggest thing I would say is to think about, like, you're going to live a long time. And so think about how you're going to pay for your life after you're not working, right? And that would be the first thing to be thinking about in terms of your financial health and your income. Is like invest in you being around for a long time. And once you get that kind of stabilized, then I could think about other ways to think about wealth and in terms of home ownership. But having that kind of nest egg or investment strategy for retirement, or even if you're not going to retire, you may get to a place where you just don't want to work as much as you're working now. Thinking about those strategies is important too. I just know that when I came up, we just didn't unfortunately, I lived in one of those neighborhoods in which many of us didn't think we were going to live that long. And we are, right? And so there's this whole generation of folks who are, and you've got different challenges in terms of the economics of things. But think about, home ownership and wealth building is a long game. It's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. And so you got to be investing, and it's got to be always on your mind.
And I appreciate so much this point, but also your earlier comment about not blocking your blessing. I think that's quoting Miss Patti LaBelle, and this idea that you can get some information and figure out how to open the doors for yourself. In fact, you all have been answering many of the questions that have been coming up through the chat, and there are a few different questions here about down payment assistance and resources, and we will be sure to follow up this panel with posting up some resources that have been offered and suggested here. I'd love to take a 1-minute speed round before Jim comes on here for us and get a sense of what is it that's keeping you all up at night. You are busy, you are focused, you are on mission, but right now, these incredible portfolios that you're leading and all the impact that you're driving, as you think about this work every day and you look ahead into the next 20 years or so, as we've been talking, what are you worried about? What's on your mind? And what can we be hopeful about, or what's on your mind? John, how about you? What's on your mind?
The speculative market. I think that, we are looking now at folks who are aging in place and turning towards the end of their life. We're looking at different folks, again, who, as properties become available, they're investors who can walk into different communities and just sort of pay outright and buy up those properties and raise the prices. So I think for us, as a land trust organization and other folks who are into cooperative housing, we want to be fully invested in taking properties off that speculative market and keeping that long-term affordability. Yeah, that's one of the things that keep me up at night. And Crystal, thank you for making that point about folks having a financial education. I just think too that, we have lots of immigrants who are coming here, and that's sometimes a missing piece. Like the home ownership thing is fine, and you build to that. And again, we think that's really important. But having the financial education and the investment piece, I didn't learn that till later on, and right. And learning all of that is important. Thank you.
Speed round. How about you, Crystal? What's on your mind? What's keeping you up at night?
What keeps me up at night is our larger political environment that we're living in this country. I am often terrified that we're moving to a place in which there's such a divide along all kinds of lines that, it's just going to, it just keeps me up at night. It's a place where I'm not sure where we go from here and how we keep making progress.
Agree. AJ, how about you? Thanks, Crystal.
Empowerment. keeps me up at night. I think there's lots of information, lots of tools, lots of resources. What keeps me up at night is, am I doing enough to make sure people are aware of what is there? And then the second thing that keeps me up at night, are we using our creative juices? Am I, with my neighborhood and community lending role, to think more creatively around how to solve financial wellness and solve home ownership, and also support small business? I didn't mention that, but just the whole entrepreneur track for people to have control of their lives. Those are the three things that keep me up at night.
Well, thank you all for this incredible panel. I know Jim is going to wrap us up here, but lots of things keeping all of us up at night. And I look forward to continuing to build this work and joining arms in partnership. Thank you so much.
Well, Carolyn, thank you. And thank you, Crystal, John, AJ, for such an important conversation. But in addition, all the work that you do personally in your organizations, Bank of America, Mass Housing, Dudley Street Initiative. I said at the beginning that this idea of home ownership and closing the wealth gap is going to take working together among business and community and government and others. And certainly we saw that on display today. There's a lot of ingredients that goes into it. I enjoyed, the shift in focus that took place during the dialogue from just how to get a new home to how to sustain home ownership. I thought that was an important element of this conversation, which of course was an element of this idea of financial wellness being such an important part of the journey, as Crystal said, towards wealth. You think about the ingredients of income, you think about taking inventory of your financial wellness. I thought that was quite an important dimension of the conversation. Carolyn, as you said, this hour is going to go by fast. It went by in warp speed. There's so many dimensions to this conversation we didn't get to in depth, so we could have kept going about that issue that you raised toward the end of inventory here in Boston and Massachusetts. And I know Crystal was probably on the edge of her seat waiting to talk about how to sort of get more housing inventory into the marketplace. I was glad, John, you raised the issue of the speculative market and what's going on, particularly in other states. AJ, you probably see it more than we do here in Massachusetts, but that's a real serious issue that we're going to have to deal with as a country. And to that end, I wish we got a chance to talk about the role of the federal government in housing, generally speaking. It seems that over the last generation or so, we've gotten a little bit out of the housing market in the way that we were in it in years gone by, and maybe there's a place for the federal government that we didn't explore either in this conversation. So a little bit long-winded closing, Carolyn, but you guys stimulated a lot of thinking, a lot of thoughts, which was the intent here. Thank you to our sponsors at Putnam and Stephen and Bob Reynolds for making this all possible. We'll announce the next installment in the coming weeks in this series. We're going to focus on something that comes up quite a bit, which is access to capital. It'll be a virtual event that'll focus on community funds, collective wealth building, and investor strategies. So please keep an eye out for the announcements around that. Again, thank you again to our speakers and to all of you who made the time to participate in this event today, and have a great rest of the day and weekend.